On the surface, it might have looked like we were outmatched. The seven systems had spent centuries building their reputation, steamrolling independent colonies, forcing lesser species into servitude, and crushing anyone who dared oppose them. They were brutal, efficient, and above all, convinced of their own invincibility. And why wouldn't they be? No civilization had ever stopped them once their war fleets arrived. No one had ever outmaneuvered them without resorting to bloodshed. No one until now. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, but Commander Rahl kept his voice steady. Maintain course. No hostile action. His words cut through the noise, a simple command that went against every instinct we had. We had spent months preparing for this moment. On every screen, tactical data scrolled in endless streams: power levels, ship movements, intercept trajectories. The seven systems were waiting for us to panic, to flinch. They were looking for an excuse to justify their attack. We gave them nothing. Seconds stretched into minutes. The fleet outside did not open fire. Instead, they adjusted, recalculating, analyzing, searching for the weakness they were certain must be there. The seven systems did not believe in stalemates. They believed in dominance, swift and absolute. And yet, for the first time, they hesitated. They had expected fear. They had expected defiance. What they hadn't expected was silence. Behind the scenes, the real battle was already underway. This wasn't a war of missiles and lasers. This was something far more insidious. While the seven systems focused on our seemingly passive stance, they failed to notice what was happening inside their own fleet. Systems began to lag. Minor malfunctions rippled through their networks. Shield harmonics wavered by barely detectable degrees. It started slow, too subtle for their engineers to catch immediately. But it spread, creeping through every ship like a virus. Because that's exactly what it was. Months before this confrontation, we had found a weakness, a single tiny flaw buried deep in the code that ran their fleet-wide combat systems. Something so small that no one had ever thought to exploit it. Something that, under the right conditions, could be turned against them. And now, as their warships hovered at the edge of our space, every one of them was running on compromised systems. They didn't know it yet, but their ships weren't theirs anymore. Then, the first warning light flickered aboard their command ship. A power fluctuation. A minor irregularity in their security logs. Isolated incidents, at least. That's how it would seem at first. The seven systems prided themselves on technological superiority, on systems that were virtually untouchable. But nothing is truly invulnerable. Not when someone is patient enough to find the cracks. I glanced at the main display, watching as their ships subtly adjusted positions, trying to compensate for problems they couldn't yet identify. They thought they were still in control. That illusion wouldn't last much longer. One by one, their systems would fail. One by one, their weapons would become unresponsive. One by one, they would realize that for the first time in their long and bloody history, they had walked into a battle they could not win. And they had lost it before the first shot was ever fired. A voice crackled through our comms, tense and edged with frustration. It was their admiral, the one who had led 100 successful campaigns, now standing on the precipice of his first failure. "You are making a grave mistake." His words were meant to intimidate, but there was something else beneath the surface. A hesitation, a shadow of doubt creeping into his voice. Commander Rahl leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "No," he said, voice steady, assured. "We're making history." Outside, the seven systems fleet loomed, unaware that its own downfall had already begun. And soon, very soon, they would realize just how powerless they truly were. The Admiral's silence stretched across the comms, a hollow pause filled with calculations he couldn't complete. His fleet was still in formation, still bristling with weapons, but something had changed. The certainty, the quiet arrogance that had always accompanied the seven systems war machine had begun to erode. His ships were no longer an unstoppable force, they were unknown variables, shifting in ways he didn't understand. And for the first time, he was realizing it. Aboard their vessels, officers scrambled to diagnose what was happening. Targeting arrays flickered in and out, shields cycled unpredictably. Propulsion systems lagged by fractions of a second, small, almost imperceptible failures that compounded with each passing moment. We saw it happening in real time. Their formations lost their sharpness, their movements slowed. It was like watching a predator slowly lose its fangs without realizing why the kill was slipping away. The Admiral's voice returned, but the confidence was gone. "State your demands." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even an attempt at negotiation. It was something far rarer from the seven systems, a concession. He had come expecting conquest, but now, surrounded by warships he no longer trusted, he was grasping for control in a battle he hadn't even understood was being fought. Commander Rawl exchanged a glance with the officers around him. We had expected them to take longer to notice. The cascade should have been gradual, building into an unstoppable unraveling of their systems. But the Admiral was no fool, and neither were his tacticians. They didn't need to understand how we had done it to know that something was terribly wrong. And that made them dangerous. Without warning, one of their ships broke formation. It wasn't an attack run, nor was it a retreat. It was something stranger, an erratic drift, as if the vessel had suddenly lost its sense of direction. Seconds later, another ship followed. Then, another. The fleet wasn't just experiencing failures anymore, it was losing coordination entirely. One of our analysts swore under his breath. They're running independent diagnostics, trying to isolate the source. Rawl's jaw tightened. If they did, they might find a way to reboot, to cut out the infected systems before the full effect took hold. That couldn't be allowed to happen. But then, something unexpected happened. The Seven Systems command ship, the very heart of their fleet, sent out a high-priority override signal, a desperate attempt to regain control over the slipping formations. We had anticipated that. What we hadn't anticipated was the response. Instead of stabilizing, the override fractured their systems even further. Their ships, still running on compromised code, didn't recognize the command as a reset. Instead, they interpreted it as a security breach. We watched as the fleet's own cyber defenses turned inward, treating their own admiral's orders as an unauthorized intrusion. One by one, the warships began locking themselves out of their own command functions. Weapons powered down, navigation controls froze, encrypted firewalls went up against their own officers. The Seven Systems, masters of control, had lost the ability to command their own fleet. It was a complete collapse, faster and more devastating than we could have hoped for. And yet, even as we witnessed the unraveling of a force that had terrorized countless civilizations, there was a single chilling truth that we couldn't ignore. The Admiral still wasn't panicking. Through the chaos, his voice returned, quieter this time. "You think you've won." There was something unsettling in his tone. Not anger. Not even desperation. Just the cold certainty of a man who still had cards left to play. "You don't understand what you've started." A flicker of movement on the edge of our sensors drew our attention. A ship, smaller than the others, slipping through the gaps in the failing fleet. It had been hidden among the larger warships, masked by their signatures, but now it was moving with purpose. Directly toward us. This hadn't been part of the plan. And for the first time, we realized that while we had spent months preparing to dismantle their fleet, we might have overlooked something crucial. The real threat hadn't been the armada in front of us. It had been the unknown buried within it, and it was coming straight for us. The small ship cut through the chaos of the failing fleet like a knife through silk, moving with precision that no warship should have had under these conditions. It was a ghost slipping between giants, untouched by the cascading system failures that had crippled the others. It wasn't faltering. It wasn't hesitating. And that made it far more dangerous than any battleship in the Seven Systems armada. We ran scans, but the results made no sense. No known registry. No matching transponder. Just an anonymous vessel buried within the fleet until now, waiting for the exact moment to make its move. We had been so focused on dismantling their war machine that we had failed to ask the most important question: what had they hidden in their own ranks? Rawl's voice came sharp and immediate. "Target that ship. Lock it down." Our systems worked flawlessly, unaffected by the corruption we had seeded in theirs. Targeting arrays snapped to the small vessel. Automated defenses primed in an instant. And yet, before we could fire, the ship did something that caught us completely off guard. It stopped. Not a drift, not a loss of power. A deliberate, controlled halt just beyond our defensive perimeter. Then, a transmission. No encryption, no hidden codes. Just a single open-frequency message played across every channel. "You don't know what you've done." The voice wasn't the Admiral's. It wasn't any of the usual 7 systems commanders. It was something else entirely mechanical, layered, a synthetic tone threaded with something almost human. A voice that didn't belong to any species we knew. Our analysts worked fast, running vocal recognition, searching for any match in known databases. But we already knew what the results would be. There wouldn't be any. The Admiral's earlier warning came back in full force. "You don't understand what you've started?" We had assumed he was bluffing, trying to regain control. But now, as that unknown ship hovered in place, untouched by our interference, something about it felt wrong. Then our sensors picked up something new. Not from the 7 systems fleet, not from the ship in front of us. Something beyond. Something vast. A distortion in space, subtle at first, like a shimmer against the black. Then another. Then dozens. One of our officers turned pale. "We're detecting gravitational anomalies. Multiple. No one needed to say it out loud. We knew what it meant. The 7 systems were ruthless, but they weren't reckless. They didn't send fleets without a guarantee of victory. And if they had sent this fleet knowing it could fail, then they must have had something waiting in reserve." Commander Rahl's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now. "Confirm their signatures." The readings came in waves, the data overwhelming, impossibly vast. These weren't reinforcements. This wasn't another war fleet hiding in the dark. It was something worse. The 7 systems hadn't just been expanding their empire. They had been digging, searching. And, it seemed, they had finally found what they were looking for. The unknown ship's transmission flared to life again, but this time, it wasn't a message. It was a signal. A pulse of data launched across the void, aimed directly at the anomalies. And then, for the first time in all of recorded history, the stars themselves answered. The distortion rippled outward, and from its depths, shapes began to emerge. Not warships. Not vessels of any known design. These were something older. Something colossal. They unfolded from the void like living shadows, their forms shifting, adapting, stretching into shapes that defied understanding. They had no markings, no insignias, no allegiance. Just a presence so vast that it made even the 7 systems war fleet seem small in comparison. A realization struck us all at once. This hadn't been about conquest. It hadn't even been about us. The 7 systems had come here for one reason: to wake something up. And whether they had meant to or not, they had succeeded. The Admiral's voice returned one last time, raw with something we had never expected to hear from him. "Regret. We never controlled them," he admitted. "We only found the key." Rahl's breath was slow, measured. He understood the weight of what we had just witnessed. We had won the battle. We had brought the 7 systems to their knees without firing a shot. But in doing so, we had unknowingly opened a door that had remained closed for eons. And now, whatever was behind it was stepping through. The unknown ship pulsed its signal again. And this time, the colossal shapes responded. Not with weapons, not with words, but with movement and awakening, a turning of vast and ancient forms toward us, as if noticing us for the very first time. We had disabled the fleet. We had stopped a war. But as the black depths of space twisted around those unknowable entities, it became clear. This wasn't an ending.